Good afternoon, all. This afternoon's presentation is about a possible conversion of a Caledonian 90 class locomotive. And the raw materials are a Hornby M7 chassis and a CDC Designs body. The 92 class was built in the 1890s or so for the opening of the low-level lines through Central Station underneath Argyle Street and London Road out to Bridgeton and so on. And you can see there the shop photograph and the extra machinery for the condensing equipment that ran from the smoke box through into the tank, in and out of the tank, and then finally the exhausts above the cab. And also the more elaborate Westinghouse system underneath the cab. The 92 class then, a total of 22 built at St Wallach's in Springburn in the 1890s and designed to work in lines which were substantially underground for considerable periods. There were some ventilation shafts built in, but it was necessary to try and limit the amount of effluent that the locomotives spewed out. It was therefore fitted with condensing apparatus as shown in the photograph. Briefly, some carried the standard passenger blue livery. They were designed for short stopping suburban and intracity trains in the Glasgow area, but they did not survive in the blue livery very long, simply because they got filthy. And they were therefore converted to the black goods livery in fairly short order. The class was developed slightly by Macintosh, slightly larger, and was the forerunner of the 439 class, one of which is preserved at Bo'ness. And the identical dimensions make it a stick-on for modelling and converting. If you look at the 92 class, the 439 and the M7, which was built for the London and South Western Railway by Dougal Drummond, of course, he'd also served his time at St Wallach's. In fact, he developed St Wallach's during his tenure there as loco superintendent. The 92 class, using old money dimensions, was a fairly standard 044 tank with 5'9" drivers and 3'2" bogie wheels. The 439 was identical in size. There were obviously small differences between the 92 and the 439, but not appreciable in terms of the critical dimensions. For the M7, I couldn't find the length over the buffers, but the frame itself was a good 3 feet or 2.5 feet longer, and then you have the buffer. So a larger locomotive altogether. But critically, the drivers were only 2 inches smaller, less than a millimetre in 4mm scale. The bogie wheels slightly bigger, but again, a couple of millimetres tops. The coupled wheelbase was the same, and the wheelbase slightly longer there, but not critically. So a pretty good match in terms of the dimensions. Now, the CDC Designs 044, built based on the 439 preserved locomotive, is a 3D printed loco available in various versions. That's the fully lined Caledonian one, looking quite nice in the light blue livery, and it comes in at £63. But the plain black one, which they also offered, came in at 48, and that's what I used for the conversion. Although, in fairness, I should say that I did buy the passenger blue one pictured there as well. In terms of donors, the CDC recommend using the original M7 produced by Hornby, but it's a rather dated looking locomotive now. It was first produced in 1967 or so, and current in the 70s. I nearly bought one then, about 72, 73, where you could get the M7, 2 coaches, an oval of track, and a controller for the princely sum of £3.75. However, I didn't, so I had to buy one for 35 quid or so on eBay. However, the Achilles heel of the original 67 one is that pickup is on driving wheels only. And given the state of my track and given the fact that it's also going to exhibitions, running was not as reliable as would be appreciated. The later one that Hornby produced, around about 2006, I was managed to buy for 74 quid on eBay. And it's a much better looking model altogether. And critically, pickup is on all 8 wheels. So that was the one I decided to use for the conversion. So the main tasks, given the greater length of the M7, is to shorten the chassis at the rear and at the front. Fairly brutal, but absolutely necessary. The thing won't fit otherwise. Given the weight of the chassis, which is above the driving wheels, because 044s are very difficult locos to balance, there's a huge weight above the driving wheels, and the smoke box and boiler had to be hollowed out to accommodate this much larger weight. Likewise, the cab floor had to be taken away at the front and the back of the boiler to accommodate the chassis and the motor in particular. The brake cylinders at the back are rather well made, but given the tight curves on shield inch, the radius 2 curves would not accommodate the motor and a chassis as it was under the body. So that they had to be hollowed out. And likewise, in the cosmetic side, the pipework from the boiler had to be taken away and the condensing gear added. The pipework to the boiler in the tank and the external exhausts by the cab. Now, the front end, and at this point, it's where you take courage in both hands and butcher the chassis. And there you can see what I've done with a slitting disc and the mechanism protected as far as possible with masking tape. The downside of this was that the fixture for the coupling hook at the front was also butchered, and that is a slight loss. It won't pull coaches when it's going backwards, but it doesn't run backwards all that well, so it's not as much of a loss as one might fear. The rear end also needed butchered to fit under the back, and you can see that the chassis has been cut away. When you're doing this, you're fortunate that the rear coupling will still be attached to the bogie. You have the option of shortening the bogie to a scale length, but I decided not to, given that I didn't want to disrupt the pickups at this point. A word of warning, when you're handling this, there's a small washer holds the bogie to pivot into the rear of the chassis. I managed to lose mine, so be very careful when you're handling this. I was able to make a replacement, but I was perplexed for a while as to why it wouldn't run. More butchering work with a drill to hollow out the 3D printed body. And you can see it's not always the prettiest job, but at least the resin will grind away relatively quickly. In fact, you have to be careful that you don't overshoot and go through the boiler. Likewise, the cab had to be cut away, the rear end of the boiler, to accommodate the motor. There we have, with the butchery done, the original pipe running from the smoke box to the cab has been cut away because that didn't feature on the original. It was a later addition by St. Rollox. And there you can see the two sets of pipes at the smoke box end. And I pondered as what to use best. Brass rod would have been ideal, but getting it to bend without breaking would have been possibly problematic. So what I resolved to use in the end were the sticks from cotton buds. And they, once painted up, I'm sure will look fine. So you can see there's one pair coming out of the smoke box and another at the top of the tank. What I did wish I had done in retrospect was to take off the handrail wires, which are not the most elegant feature of the original casting. I should have replaced them with brass, but that's perhaps for another time. The exhaust pipes at the front of the cab are the centres of refills for ballpoint pens, and they cut away quite nicely, and all of the extra fixtures glued in place. The brake cylinders also had to be hollowed out quite dramatically to give sufficient side play, and also, in fact, the insides of the cab steps, and in fact, the rear buffer bar as well, just to give enough space for the chassis and for the bogie side play. To fix this in, once I'd done all the carving, I put in a BA bolt, I think it was an 8, and glued it in place, left it to set overnight, and then you have the 8BA fixing screw there. You can also see the screw or the sprung buffers that are supplied. And there she goes, ready to paint. Been washed, scrubbed, and so on. And the boiler fittings, they will be masked rather for painting. Likewise, the buffers. And you can see that the rear coupling can be fitted back in place. So the first coat, a spray of black, and a second one to follow. Reasonably successful, I think. I simply use black spray primer. It's fairly matte, which is not a bad match for Caledonian goods locomotives. And then she is lined and got the transfers on as well. These are eventually fixed with spray varnish. A couple of coats of satin, I think, is one that probably works well. The application of the lining is quite tricky, I think we would say, because we can't get Fox to produce red and white Calais style lining. So it has to be done in 2 stages, with the exterior ones put on first, then gloss varnished and left to set overnight, and then the interior, the white lines by and large, fixed in place then. The brass number plate, I'd run out of Calais ones, but I used an old etch as a template to get the size right, and it's simply a bit of plastic card painted with old gold paint from Vallejo, and then transfer numbers attached there. Always remembering that if you're using a metallic paint, even an acrylic one, do that after you've done the varnishing, otherwise it will run. So she's lined, she's lettered and number plated. I decided to go with number 92, the original member of the class. And here she is in sight. The second spray has toned the locomotive up quite nicely. Crew added, always I think a good touch. Very little coal in the bunker because these were hard-working locomotives. And I don't think it's particularly obvious the origin of the exhaust pipes or indeed the condensing tubes. Ready to go with a coach of 6 wheelers. And finally, yes, we will see her actually pulling away. Now, one of the problems with 044s, and for that matter, to a lesser extent, 440s, is adhesion. And you'll see the problems in a second. So off she goes. So this turned out to be the maximum load. Now you'll see her slowing down because I wasn't aware there was a slight gradient. And in fact, the loco actually stops there. 044 is very vulnerable to gradients, intended or otherwise. So in fact, I think what we look at now is not the maximum load, but something that's a bit more appropriate. We go on to the ideal load. Perhaps a bit of regulation on the speed controller would have helped here. You'll see her careering round, like Prometheus unbound. But a surprising difference that only one coach load makes. So, reflections, looking back on the build. The unpainted body is fine. It would be a bit of a shame if the beautifully finished line body was used and spoiled. The new M7 chassis is infinitely superior. The pickup on 8 wheels is just the bee's knees. Even so, 044 locos will have adhesion problems. And this is possibly made worse because I've been spreading a solution that I got from David Dick to help keep the track clean. You put it on both track and wheels, but it does cause extra adhesion problems. But it does keep the track beautifully clean, especially for exhibition running. I did manage to mangle the brake gear, and it can foul points if I'm not careful. Perhaps I should have taken them off before the build. The loss of the front coupling, unfortunate, but the conversion doesn't run terribly well rearwards anyway, so it's not the loss that you might fear. It's an unusual model with the condensing gear and the livery as well. And it is a nice conversation piece at exhibitions, especially when it's running as a light engine. And I still have the original M7 and the line body to do. But that, they say, is not for another day, but for another year. And that is the end.